Diplomacy and acting, diplomacy and hurricanes, diplomacy and zombies. I'm David Hood of the Diplomacy Broadcast Network, and this is Deadline, DBN's monthly news program. Dateline, May 2023. For our feature story, one of the true successes of the pandemic era of diplomacy play was the growth of Nexus, an online space devoted to bringing together DIP fans from multiple web-based and app-based platforms to compete together in a diplomacy format in a tournament. Organized primarily on Discord, Nexus helped to stitch together disparate pieces of the fabric of online diplomacy play and, in the process, build community between those players. We also now have a separate Nexus Leagues Discord as well, which features ongoing league play as distinguished from the one-off tournament set up on the original Nexus. We also have, for our viewing pleasure, full coverage available of various Nexus season final boards through the Diplomat's YouTube channel. Later in the program, we will interview Keith Worstell, one of the commentators on the Diplomats, about the Nexus Season 8 final game as it winds down to its conclusion at the end of the game year 1910. But first, a look at headlines from around the world of diplomacy. The 2023 Italian National Championship of Diplomacy was held the first weekend of May in the Republic of San Marino. Past World DipCon winner Thomas Haver from Ohio in the U.S. took the top prize, with Russian Alex Lebedev in second and longtime Italian hobbyist Davide Cleopadre coming in third. Haver also took best country honors in both Austria and Turkey, while Lebedev had the best Italy and Cleopadre the best France. Luigi Sabaffi and Wes Ketchum also received best country awards. A number of photos and other information about the event can be found on the Facebook page for European Diplomacy, a link to which is provided below. Also provided is a link to the Origins Game Fair website. That's where Thomas Haver will be running a diplomacy event, as he usually does, at that General Games Convention in Columbus, Ohio, held in late June. Back to Europe, though, the Francophone Association of Diplomacy Players, known as the AFJD, has announced the upcoming face-to-face French Championship, which will be the weekend of July 14th through 16th in Champs-sur-Léon, not too far from the city of Nantes. This 39th annual championship event is to be held inside the main reception room of the La Thomas Winery and will feature 4 games of diplomacy over 3 days, using C-Diplo scoring, with each game to last about 4 hours. For more information, visit the link below to the Facebook page of Gabriel Lecontre. If you cannot go that far for your diplomacy fix all the way to France, we do have a North American Diplomacy Federation event scheduled that same weekend. It's in Denver, Colorado. The return of the Regatta, a face-to-face event put on by the Armada Diplomacy Club. Regatta was once an integral part of the NADF tournament circuit, hosting DipCon in 2001 and World DipCon in 2003. It's great to have that event back on the schedule. A link to the tournament information is also provided below. Did you see the diplomacy video on YouTube that garnered nearly 800,000 views back at the beginning of 2023? Yeah, no, I hadn't either until recently. It involves 7 friends playing the game online, while one of them is experiencing an actual hurricane. I've provided the link below. Would some of you youngins go and watch the thing and then report back to me just what in the bloody blue blazes I was watching? I'd really be much obliged. Veilfisk is the UK-based YouTuber and video game designer responsible for this diplomacy content, for those who are familiar with his game on Steam called Crypt. Speaking of which, one big takeaway for me from watching this video was that the tabletop simulator version of diplomacy he used was actually pretty attractive. And any DIP-related content with roughly 797,000 views, it's all right with me. I mentioned the upcoming tournament in Denver for mid-July. That is just the tip of the iceberg for summer diplomacy this season. Over the weekend of July 26 through 28, the 2023 edition of the VWDC Summer Classic is expected to take place on the VWDC Discord server. This virtual face-to-face tournament got its start during the pandemic, when many face-to-face events held virtual versions instead of live ones. But in the case of the Summer Classic, that was and is intended as a virtual-only event, to be paired with the Virtual Diplomacy Championship taking place every year in December. Stay tuned for more information by joining the VWDC Discord server at the link provided below. And then the weekend after the Summer Classic, we'll see the return of the venerable face-to-face tournament known as the Boston Massacre, run by Alex Maslow. This year's event, the first weekend in August, will take place at Pandemonium Books and Games in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and will feature one round each of Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. A registration form is linked below. Speaking of virtual diplomacy, have you looked lately at the Wikipedia page for tournament and league championships of diplomacy history? The current version is linked below. You will notice that it has expanded to include forms of diplomacy play which got their start during the pandemic. There are now listings for the Virtual Diplomacy Championship, the Virtual Diplomacy League, and the DBN Invitational to go along with the online and face-to-face events that had already been listed. Now, while you're there, you will see several listings for events no longer in existence. In particular, the North American Grand Prix, the European Grand Prix, and the Bismarck Cup, which was sort of a Grand Prix for the Australia-New Zealand hobby. All you prospective volunteer organizers out there, there is work to be done, either resurrecting these ideas or coming up with some new ones of your own. Don't just sit there being a diplomacy consumer. Consider giving back to the hobby with organizing, writing for hobby publications, starting a podcast, or whatever you think you can contribute to the growth and development of our hobby. Want to bounce some ideas off of someone? My proverbial door is always open. Just email me at the address provided at the end of the broadcast. Now, let's take a trip around the world of YouTube channels and other diplomacy content creators to report to you on the latest and greatest new diplomacy products from whom we call our DBN media partners. Florida Man recently released a new video about the controversial hobby practice known as message forwarding. This is when someone either forwards an email or message from one player to a third party to break the confidentiality of the original two-way conversation. While many find this practice distasteful, Florida Man himself defends its use under certain circumstances. A link to his video can be found below. The weekly newsletter called the Diplomacy Briefing included in its May 12th issue an analysis of the new 6th edition Diplomacy Rulebook. It was created by longtime hobbyist and interview guest on this very show last month, David E. Cohen. David looked at the new rulebook and then described each of the changes made by Renegade Games to the rules in preparation for its release of the new diplomacy sets later this summer. These changes include some helpful clarifications, as well as additional end-of-game victory conditions for time-limited and turn-limited games. You can read this content at the link provided below in the show notes. The latest edition of our League Night show here on the Diplomacy Broadcast Network was released on April 29th, and it was quite a doozy. 6 games from the Virtual Diplomacy League were covered in detail, along with both the March and April editions of the Tour of Britain, which is the other English language league designed for virtual face-to-face play. The game results from League Night included 1 board top by Russia, a couple by France, with all of the rest featuring an English board top, including 2 games where they edged the Turk at the end of the game by 1 center, and there was another game where Bradley Grace's England was stopped at 17 centers by Austria. Will England dominate the games on the next League Night broadcast scheduled for May 20th? I very much doubt it, but you should watch and find out for yourself. In past episodes here on Deadline, we have discussed the use of our game in high school and college classrooms, as well as in business or military training. The upshot is, diplomacy gets used a lot. But until I saw a paper from Shauna Brandel of the City University of New York's Kingsborough Community College, I had no idea that diplomacy had been pedagogically paired with zombies. Brandel explains in the piece that I have linked below from the Journal of Political Science Education that she decided to be creative in attracting and energizing college students to her international relations classes by adding movies, games, and a textbook called Theories of International Politics and Zombies. I'm not kidding. As far as the games are concerned, she uses realism, rock, paper, scissors, the prisoner's dilemma, and of course, diplomacy, basing all of this on an earlier 2005 academic piece regarding which games to use in the teaching of international relations. While she reported mixed results for some of her innovations, when reporting on the impact of diplomacy on her students, she released that many of her students were highly engaged in the gameplay and wrote very strong essays about their experience afterwards. My favorite quote from one of the students: "I'm not saying that all alliances are bad, because they're not. All I'm saying is be smart about when to join an alliance." End quote. Preach, sister. Preach. Now, let's report on the latest news from the world of diplomacy fan magazines, which we in the hobby just call zines. Issue 47 of Simon Langley Evans' zine called Last Orders came out just a couple of weeks ago. In this special coronation issue, Simon talks about political and social news in his native United Kingdom, provides book reviews for several novels he's read since the last issue of Last Orders, and of course publishes the game reports from the games he's running in the zine, which include classic diplomacy, the intimate diplomacy variant, by popular demand, and other games. Also, the US-based hobbyist Andy Lachette has been running his zine Cheesecake since David Hood joined the hobby. Hint, that's a long time ago. Andy's April 12th issue included his game reports plus a quiz called You Be the GM, along with a letter column, book reviews, and listing of diplomacy game openings in other zines. Andy is actually looking for more players. So if you are interested, send him an email using Andy@Lachette, which is LISCHETT.com. It's now time for a segment which we call My Favorite Things, in which we interview a diplomacy hobbyist about their passion or interest, whether or not related to diplomacy. This month, we welcome to Deadline North Carolina dipper Randy Lawrence Hurt to talk a little bit about why he is missing his local tournament, DixieCon, this year. Hello, Randy. Welcome back to Deadline News.
Thanks for having me, David. Good to be here.
Yeah, sure. All right. I always like to start out with a little hobby biographical information. So tell us about your involvement in the diplomacy hobby in the past, the present, and what you've been up to.
Sure. I've been involved in diplomacy and the hobby since I was 14 or 15 or so. Started playing online through the Diplomatic Pouch. Then I started going to tournaments, Boston Massacre, and then any others I could find. Peak involvement was probably about a decade ago in my early mid-20s. Since then, it's definitely tapered off, just life and work getting in the way. But I still try to get to a tournament or two a year. I served on the NADF board for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. But my tenure there ended at the start of this year, and now I'm just kind of a member at large, I would say, of the hobby.
Well, you have been large. I mean, you've run tournaments and been to tournaments. But speaking of tournaments, you're not coming to DixieCon in a couple of weeks, and you live like an hour from there. So what gives, man?
It's a matter of priorities. I actually managed to get cast in a show that I was very excited for. I do community theater, and there's a show going up just south of where I live that I really wanted to be in. And I was fortunate enough to get cast and get exactly the part that I wanted. So their opening weekend is the same weekend as DixieCon. So while I hope to swing by on Sunday and say hi to folks, I unfortunately will not be participating.
All right. Well, tell us more about what has taken you away from us for the weekend. About why did you go for this play? Why did you want to do this role?
Sure. Well, the play is called The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, which some folks, particularly maybe some of the older or more experienced members of the hobby, may recognize. It's a pretty famous Western movie from the 50s or 60s. John Wayne, a couple of other fairly big names in it. The play itself is been told fairly distinct from the movie, pretty different story. It tracks closer to the short story that both the movie and the play were based off of, but it still keeps that style of kind of a gritty Western, couple of laughs, but for the most part, it's very serious. A young man from the East moves west to try to make some sort of a difference and quickly discovers that the world is much more complicated and dangerous than he'd initially thought, springing from a run-in he has with me, Liberty Valance. So I was drawn to the play both because it's very serious. Community theater generally does comedies and musicals, because that's what pulls people in. People want to go out, have a laugh, listen to some music. So it's fairly rare that you see a theater doing a really serious, at times very dark show like this one. So that was certainly exciting. And then the role of Liberty Valance is one that I was very interested in trying to get into. It's just a straight up evil character. As I mentioned, most community theaters just do comedies and musicals, so most of the roles that I've gotten have just been funny, or I've played leads, I've played supporting, but for the most part I've played the lighthearted character, or if I play like kind of a bad guy, it's a funny bad guy. He's not actually serious or evil or whatever. He's kind of more a character to laugh at than to be frightened of. Liberty Valance is totally different, just straight up evil through and through, no redeeming qualities, and that is a challenge that I've never gotten to take on before, so I was really excited to give it a shot.
Yeah, you have only taken on that challenge over a diplomacy board, I would say.
Yeah, I've gotten used to playing the heel in a game, so I wanted to see if I could translate that onto the stage.
Fair enough. What other stage experience, theater experience do you have?
I've been acting even longer than I've been playing diplomacy, actually. Probably about 25 years at this point. I was doing it in middle school and high school. I was involved in a Shakespeare group, actually. Took a little of a break in college, but since college, I've done a show or two a year for the most part. Some of my favorite prior roles, if people, I don't know how familiar people are with plays in general, but I've done Unnecessary Farce a couple of times. That always makes the circuits of around community theater. I did the oh my god, I'm blanking on the other ones.
Weren't you in Boeing, or am I making that up?
Yes, that was just this past fall. I was in Boeing. I was the lead in that one, which is a very funny show. So I don't know. It's hard to summarize 25 years worth of acting history, but I've done a little bit of everything except for really serious, gritty dramas.
Well, you're not the only person in the diplomacy hobby who has some stage or theater experience. Is there anything about our game which you think makes it a little more theatrical as opposed to other board games, or at least attract people with a little more, I don't know, personality?
Well, only everything, right? I mean, diplomacy is a game of personalities. It's been beaten to death, but the mechanics of the game itself are very simple. You can become a master of the tactics of the game pretty easily, especially compared to some of the heavier Euro games out there that can take a long time to master, and maybe no one ever actually does. The actual heart of diplomacy is how you connect with other people in a specific setting. And sometimes it's how well you convince those people that you are not what you say you are, or that you're somehow different than how you seem. So I would say there's a massive amount of overlap between diplomacy and acting. And it's not surprising to me that we have a small community of actors involved in diplomacy. And frankly, I think more people who play diplomacy should try to get into acting. They might find that they really enjoy it.
And maybe vice versa, honestly.
Absolutely.
Are there particular skills that you can think of? I mean, obviously you've mentioned a couple, but is there anything in particular skill-wise in terms of interpersonal relations that you think is easily transferable from one to the other?
Yeah. I mean, in terms of what's transferable from either one, at the basis level, lying is what you're doing. When you act, you are lying. You're pretending that something that isn't true is true. So obviously that's useful in diplomacy. If you're planning to work out a big stab, you want to be able to put on a convincing performance that you're not about to do that. If people can see right through you, then you're probably not going to be able to stab very effectively. And similar in acting. I mean, if people can tell that you're on a stage moving where you've been told and reciting lines that have been written by someone else, then you're not actually a very good actor. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. Doesn't mean you can't have fun, but it just means that, you're just not very good at it. There is on a deeper level than that, though. Community theater is really about the first part of that phrase. It's about community. It's a very small community, at least down here around the Raleigh area. It's probably a few hundred people at most that do it regularly, at least in the theaters that I'm involved in. So you know just about everybody, or at the very least you've seen just about everybody, which is similar to diplomacy. There's, a few hundred, maybe 1,000 or so active face-to-face diplomacy players in North America. Off the top of my head, I could probably name half of them. I probably met most of them as well. So it is very much a situation where you know everyone else who's involved in it. And if you want to be successful in it, yes, being talented is important. If you want to be good at diplomacy, it helps to actually be good at diplomacy. If you want to be good at acting, it helps to be a decent actor. But just as important is, integrating yourself into the community, being likable, getting along with other people. You can be the greatest diplomacy player in the world, but if people just don't like your personality, you're not going to get very far. And you can be the greatest actor in the world, but if everyone else in the cast doesn't want to hang out with you, you're probably not going to get cast, because it's not about you. It's about the entire production.
Yeah, that's really true. Is there any one thing about the show you're currently in or the role that you're playing that reminds you of diplomacy in any way?
Well, we already talked a little bit about it, playing the bad guy in the show. And even though I think of my diplomacy style as not exactly Care Bear-ish, but borderline Care Bear-ish, I still, for some reason, have a reputation of not a Care Bear, of kind of a dastardly character on the diplomacy board. So that is certainly a similarity. Other than that, the play itself is as I mentioned, a very gritty drama. It's a character drama. There's about 6 or 7 main roles, similar to a diplomacy game. Every one of them is a very clearly defined character with their own motivations, their own reasons for doing what they do, and they have their own very distinct interactions with everyone else in the play, which is very similar to a diplomacy board, obviously. You'll have 6 or ideally 7 people. They all have their own motivations on the game, and they're all pursuing them in their own way, and how they get to the end result that they do that's what defines the entire flow of the game.
Well, I can see that. I appreciate that. Well, before we leave the issue entirely, because we've already talked about your theater stuff, which is kind of the point of this interview, I want to pivot just a minute to the diplomacy hobby in general. You have been around a while and have seen it through various stages of its growth and development as a hobby. What do you think the state of the hobby is right now?
I think it's never been better, and I also think it's never had more potential. I remember when I was first started going to tournaments, closing in on 20 years ago, 17 years ago or so at this point. There was a decent turnout for most of them. There were maybe a half a dozen or so tournaments across the country, but it was pretty much all the exact same people. It was the same 20 to 30 people for the most part at every tournament, which was fine. And it was a very close-knit community. And those were, they were good people. It was a good situation. But now I'll go to tournaments and I do not know 2/3 of the people there. Possibly the only good thing to fall out of the COVID and the pandemic was the crossover between the largely online diplomacy hobby and the face-to-face diplomacy hobby. And I think that the powers that be in the face-to-face diplomacy hobby now, the tournament organizers and the NADF, have done a really wonderful job bringing in many people from online to come to face-to-face tournaments. And turnout has never been better. There's never been, as far as I know, there's never been more tournaments active in North America than there are right at this point. And along with that, I think there's never been more potential. We've got, between the Discord server, between the work that the Diplomacy Broadcast Network is doing, publications like Diplomacy World, there are so many more avenues for people to find out about the game, get involved in the hobby, find a tournament, find a local club. That I think there's never been more potential to continue drawing in these people who maybe they've heard about the game, maybe they play other games and have been kind of interested in diplomacy, or maybe they play diplomacy all the time online, but had no idea that there's a club in their town or there's a tournament one state over that they can go to and meet the other wonderful people in this hobby and get really involved. So I'm very excited for the future of the hobby.
Yeah, I am too. But do you think there are any opportunities for improvement or room for improvement in the hobby as it currently sits?
There's always room for improvement. Between reaching out to the online hobby and the development of the code of conduct that has taken place over the last couple of years. I'd say those are the biggest steps forward, the most important things that have been done. But there's certainly more to go. My vision that I tried in my small way to bring to the NADF while I was on the board, and that I am hopeful and confident the board will continue forward, is trying to turn the NADF and the diplomacy hobby in North America as a whole into a real board gaming hobby, something like what chess has, whether it is an actual defined organization, it's got membership dues, it's got people who are committed to showing up all the time, it's got financial assistance for people to travel, for people to host tournaments, a universal ranking system for the game, all these things that make it a real thing. And I don't mean to say that the NADF and the diplomacy hobby as it exists now isn't a real thing. It is, but it's a very informal organization. It's more of a club than anything else. And I think the next great step for the NADF and for the diplomacy hobby as a whole will be to turn itself into more of a formal organization that will help people not just find the hobby, find the tournaments and the clubs they want to attend, but it'll help us outreach to people as well. It'll help us create more tournaments and get even more turnout. It's the sort of thing that can extrapolate growth.
I appreciate those thoughts very much. I can't pass up the chance to say your shirt says United. I know that you are a soccer fan. In fact, you are a Major League Soccer fan, are you not?
Yep, Major League Soccer. My team is the New England Revolution. It's over here. Which is on the badge. It says United because it's actually United Healthcare, which is the main sponsor for the New England Revolution. I do see the way it's cut off there. It makes it sound like it could be like a Man United jersey or something.
Have you been to games there in Raleigh-Durham since you moved?
I have. There's no MLS team in Raleigh, but there actually are there's a lower division men's team. The North Carolina FC have been to a few of their games, and there's the one division of women's soccer, the North Carolina Courage, which is historically has been one of the best teams in that division. Gone to one of their games as well. A lot of fun. Tiny little stadium, so it's easy to get in. Tickets are like $20 or $30. You have yourself a couple of beers, watch the game. It's a good time.
Cool. All right. Well, you got any final thoughts for our diplomacy audience before you go off and rehearse to show to something of a very different audience?
If you haven't tried acting yet, you probably have a community theater near you. I really recommend looking into it. All the reason the diplomacy hobby is great for me is that you meet wonderful people doing it and you have a great time. That is exactly the same reason the community theater is great. And I think you'll have a wonderful time doing it. Other than that, good luck to everyone showing up at Dixie, and hopefully I see a bunch of you on Sunday.
All right, Randy, I really appreciate your time today. And now for our feature presentation. As the Season 8 final of the Nexus main event winds down into its final game years, I thought it would be fun to bring on one of the commentators from the Diplomat's YouTube coverage of that Nexus finals to give his reaction both to the gameplay and the hoopla surrounding this online press tournament. So let's welcome back to Deadline the Superstition himself, Keith Worstell. Keith, welcome back to Deadline.
Yeah, it's good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you. I know you appeared on this show a little over a year ago, I think, or maybe a year and a half ago. Give us your biographical info, if you would, and also your diplomacy origin story.
Well, my biographical, originally from Ohio, live in North Carolina. I'm a licensed optician. When I was in college at UNCG, I started playing diplomacy on Dip Bounce. I was really bad. I'd forget about my games, and there's no cell phones or push notifications. So it was kind of just like I knew about the game. I didn't really get back into it until 2017 with Conspiracy. And then from there, I started making my own variant, 1862, about 6 months later. From there, I don't know how Nexus found me, but they invaded my server and recruited me to play. I had one of the first solos, and from there I ended up starting a group of people that I actually came into the tournament later with, and it became the group known as the Hearts now, still going. After that, eventually I became a mod and started doing podcasts and then an admin. And after the pandemic lifted, I went to DixieCon for my first time, trying to do face-to-face. So yeah.
Well, it was a pleasure to meet you at DipCon last year after seeing you and talking to you over screens and stuff. Before we talk more deeply about online play, where you are a commentator, how did you find that experience of the face-to-face tournament dip last year?
It's very, very different. I find face-to-face to be more of a sport. You get that mental and physical fatigue. It's a long stretch. There's a lot of mistakes, and you can't expect the perfection. So you're going head-to-head with somebody, and there's some kind of camaraderie, especially after the game. So it's all good feelings. It feels very different than extended deadline press. Extended deadline press feels like an epic game of chess. It's more of an emotional roller coaster than it is mental and physical. It's just you get really connected to people, and it's kind of like road rage, where if you had someone in front of your face, you're fine. But I guess when you're over a computer or a phone, you get super connected, and you can get more angry than if you're in someone's face. Well, some people don't have a problem getting angry in your face, but most people don't.
Well, so, people do react differently.
It's a little different. I'm more of introverted, so it's easier to make online connections. I think in person it was hard. It was a little awkward. And that being the first tournament coming back from pandemic, I think people are more interested in getting to see the people that they haven't seen in a long time. That being said, DipCon is one of the best places if you're going to do face-to-face right off the bat, because they have other board games, so there's other icebreakers. The format's kind of spread out over an extra couple of days, so you don't feel like you're jam-packing diplomacy, and so you actually have time to socialize and actually meet people. So I definitely recommend, if you're gonna go to a face-to-face, come to North Carolina. We'll treat you right.
Well, I appreciate that. I have heard people that play a lot online or face-to-face and try the other one, that it is very different. They're both exciting and exhilarating, but in different ways. Could you compare the sort of the exhilaration or the fun aspect of it both ways?
Well, I feel like if I'm playing extended deadline, and it's one move a day, I don't really worry about tactics. I worry about perfecting my diplomacy. And there's only so much game you can talk. So, I know where you work, what you had for dinner, name of your dog. You can't get that in face-to-face. And so it's almost like you're dating somebody, and they have this exhilaration of moving forward as a group. And in face-to-face, it's really hard to make that bond in 15 minutes. And so it's a completely different feeling. Like I said, it's more sport-like to me. So you end up just moving as fast as you can, and you can't really beat yourself up for making mistakes, because everyone's going to make a mistake. Whether it's on paper or just reading the board wrong.
Yeah, in fact, if you can limit your mistakes to one per season or one per year, you're probably doing pretty well in face-to-face. Pretty good. Well, how about comparing a Nexus season final, which is what we're getting ready to talk about? Compare the experience of playing in a Nexus season final to playing either regular extended deadline or a face-to-face tournament game.
I don't think anything touches a Nexus season final. Everything has to be perfect. You're playing against really good players who have a whole day to formulate their press and their moves. And even if you're used to playing in a Nexus format, all the games are anonymous until the finals. So you have this whole insular feeling, and then all of a sudden everybody knows who you are, what you've done. Players are dredging up every game that you've done on WebDip or wherever they can find records. You have people commentating on your play, so even if they don't know what you're doing, you start second guessing even though they're not in the game. You have many people watching your game, so it's very stressful. I remember, I think I was in season 1 and 4 in the finals, and people are in Europe, they're in the Pacific Northwest, they're going to text you at 3 a.m. and if you don't text them back, then they might go with somebody else. So especially those people who like to do it at the last minute.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, I understand that is a tactic.
So,
well, we're going to have some folks watching this who don't even actually know what we're talking about when we say Nexus season final, and we're getting ready to talk about Nexus season 8 final specifically. But give us a little bit of a thumbnail sketch of what Nexus is and what this particular season means?
Nexus started off as a cross-platform diplomacy tournament where we get people from different platforms, Backstabber, VDIP, WebDip, whatever we can get enough people to make a game. And that's our first round as the tournament stands now. And so we kind of find the best people out of that. And then the semifinal rounds goes and everyone plays on Backstabber. And then the final round we do Backstabber, just to ensure that we can actually make the maps meet. But yeah, that's pretty much what it is. It's a tournament.
How long does a season typically take, just so we have a frame of reference?
You usually have 1 or 2 games, so it's about four months, I would say.
Now I know that. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Keith.
It just depends how far you go in the tournament.
Okay. Now there is Nexus, and then there's Nexus Leagues, which for people that don't know is confusing. And I don't want to get into necessarily the history of why those two things are no longer together, but just give us an idea of what is one and what is the other.
So right now, Nexus specializes in tournaments. They have our classic tournament, we have gunboat tournaments, and we have the Cold War tournament. And so pretty much when you sign up for a tournament, you're pretty much signing up for a series of games and going however far you can go. So it's a commitment. With Nexus Leagues, it's more of a community-based thing. We do have a winner at the end, but you can pretty much pick up games every other week. New games launch all the time. And it's more about building a community and the atmosphere more than a hyper-competitive atmosphere. So that's pretty much the main difference. You can kind of pick up games as you want to play them in Nexus Leagues.
And when we say Nexus and then Nexus Leagues, we're talking about two different Discord servers is where they are housed. Is that right?
Correct. They used to be housed on one, now they're housed on 2 different ones. So,
and if I remember, we'll make sure we've got some kind of information down below this episode about how one could possibly get an invite to one or both of those.
Sure.
All right. So going into this particular Season 8 final, which is the one that we're getting ready to talk about, what did you think of this particular field of the 7 players going into both the power selection phase and then the opening moves of this Season 8 final?
Well, I really like the group as it is. There's a good mix of old and new people. It's always nice to keep it fresh. There's 2 people that are brand new to Nexus. Europe, it's his first time since the preseason Season 0 Nexus, so it's his first time in the finals as well. You do have return players, Tanjin, Riaz, and Tarsier, so they are also there as well.
Right. Well, I've been watching the coverage that you all basically on the Diplomats YouTube channel do a commentary of every season, essentially, provided by you and Cedric and Ed Sullivan, who's sort of in charge of the Diplomats. I've been struck by how much of the commentary has been focused, at least to some extent, on whether Riaz Varani is or is not having his way with his neighbors. Riaz playing Austria in the game. Have I correctly perceived this?
Yeah. I think as commentators, we're going to use whatever information that we have from our personal experience or whatever we know. The newer players, we're not going to know that much about. A lot of the older players, we will have a lot more information about how they play and what they're going to do. As far as Riaz is concerned, he's definitely on an upswing. He's been doing very well on multiple different platforms, including face-to-face. And him being a sub right off the bat made him a topic of interest. And then now it kind of took the lead. And every time it looked like he would be stabbed, he wasn't. So while I think he's already a topic of interest, I don't think he would stand out against Tanjin and Tarsier off the bat, except for the moves in the game seem to suggest that he has a lot more diplomatic sway than the opportunities he's leaving open. So I would expect that he would have been stabbed by now, but he hasn't until very recently. But that happens every 1908 because Nexus ends in 1910.
At the fall of 1910, it's whoever has the most centers, with the tiebreaker being the power selection tiebreaker, right?
Correct. Yeah, 1908 is usually a stab. 1909 is grab whatever you can, and hopefully in 1910 you don't have to worry about someone throwing.
Well, hopefully.
Hasn't happened yet, but could always happen.
I think you mentioned that as we sit here today, we're in 1908. But sit here right this minute for this interview. Give us a thumbnail sketch on how the game has progressed and looks right now with a number of turns left.
Looks like there was a strong AI. They used Russia to destroy Turkey right off the bat. It seemed like there was an EG that flipped to an EF. Right now, Germany and England are pretty much deadlocked. France is out. Turkey is out. Russia's sitting on its home centers. Really can't do much. So it's looking like it's between Austria and Italy. Germany and England have a slim chance, but they're probably not going to go anywhere because they don't have any way of breaking through each other. So right now, Italy looks good. Doesn't have any enemies now that France is gone. We thought Austria was probably going to make it, but right now, I don't know. It's between Austria and Italy. They made it all the way through the end. So
well, don't say you don't know. I'm going to get you to predict right now. Which way you can hazard a prediction here? Which way is this thing going to go between Italy or Austria, or does one of the outside track people have some shot?
As of this morning, I would have said Riaz, but as of 3 p.m., once France didn't cover its only center, I think Italy's got a good shot. I think I'm going to go with.
You're going with Italy. That is, by the way, for those playing at home, that is Jackson Roberts, or as I call him, Roberts the Younger. To differentiate him from Roberts the Elder, who was in the season final, 2 years ago or last year? I'm trying to remember which one.
I think it was last year. Yeah.
But his father, Dave Roberts, was in the final last year. Both are players that we in the virtual world got to know a lot during COVID because they were both playing a lot of virtual games. So your pick is Jackson. You think Riaz has some chance?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, everyone's got a chance. It's very close. I think 8 centers is going to win this.
And Jackson, as we sit here right this minute, he's at 9 or something?
He's at 9, yeah. He's got a lot to cover. But, yeah, with France gone, I think the only way he can lose is if England moves away from the German line to stop him, which case Germany can win. So it's dicey.
You have done commentary for past season finals on Nexus. If you don't mind, give us a little bit of comparison between this game that you're watching right now and some past seasons that you've seen. Has it pretty much been played similarly or not?
Not so much. This has had strong alliance play. The Austria-Italy alliance has been incredibly strong. It's something that I like to do. I like to play with one other person and go to the end. Unfortunately, even the opening moves and the entire game has been extraordinarily boring. Everything has been very concise, and there hasn't been a lot of shakeup. So it's nice to see 1908 and it being you're kind of forced to stab. So it's neat to see everyone's positioning, and it's getting really exciting. So
you thought it was a good strategy, but it was boring to watch. Is that what you're basically saying?
Correct. Yeah, it's something I would do, but yeah, it was definitely not the most entertaining thing at first.
Well, do you think their job is to provide Keith Worstell with entertainment, or is it their job to give themselves a better chance of winning? Which one do you think is their job?
Well, since it's all about me, then it's entertainment.
All right. I thought you might answer it in that fashion. Let's change the subject a little bit. I recently joined a Discord server of yours, which is about variants, and you mentioned the fact that shortly after joining the hobby, you got into designing 1862. First of all, why did you start that particular Discord server about variants that I just joined?
Well, I had a long summary about how I make my variants, and it's kind of just like hand notes in Discord. I just type things up, and it was a little all over the place and hard to follow. It's based on Stephen Agar's guide for variants. I just elaborated a lot on it, and I use a lot of math to try to figure out how best to balance a map. And so I ended up breaking it down like I do with my heart rules. I broke down my diplomacy, and in this case I broke down how I make maps, and then I put it in form that way other people can follow it if need be. I just feel like a lot of variants in general are either too big or they miss some kind of flow that makes it hard for people who love classic diplomacy to pick up. It just feels clunky, I guess. And so I pretty much designed it to ensure that maybe we can get more variants that are refined, and I find people who build variants can be very different than our core players. So.
Well, that is very true. Alex Ronka is local to DixieCon, and he's one of those guys that has worked on variants for years. We've play tested some of his at DixieCon live before. This year, we're actually having a variant tournament like we used to do 20 years ago, using the Ancient Med variant, a five player variant.
Yep.
And I found back in those days when we were doing more variant face to face that if you had a variant of less than 7, it was easier to get multiple boards to actually have an event, and importantly, you were learning a variant or developing or getting or refining a variant that could actually have practical use in the future when you don't have 7 show up for a game, for example.
Correct. Yeah.
So
yeah,
what do you, go ahead.
That's why 62 is a modular game, so you can actually take maps and add them together. So you can play from anywhere from 2 to 18 players. After 10, it goes up in 2s. But yeah.
Got it. Well, is there a theory in variant design that makes sense that it needs to be an odd number to have diplomatic flexibility? That was one of the things that Calhammer thought when he developed diplomacy, was an odd number would be good, so you wouldn't have 2 versus 2 versus 2 versus 2 or 2 versus 2 versus 2. You'd have 2 versus 2 versus 2 and somebody hanging out. And it would.
I think that's misguided. I think that the initial having an odd is nice, but it really depends on how your map is structured. So if you have it in a way where they can just pair off, it will get boring. But it's more about how you group your neutrals and having more than 2 people being able to access a neutral area. Just like the low ends, you have England, France, and Germany able to attack and get Belgium and or Holland for those 2. But it's more the dynamic. So I think even's fine. And there's been plenty of times when Austria's out in the first 3 or 4 years, and then you're down to a 2 versus 2 versus 2 anyway. So I don't think it takes anything away.
Or in the modern diplomacy meta, Turkey is out.
Turkey is out, yeah.
1903 or 1904, and they're down to 6 people. Although that's an overdone meta, says me. Well, before we leave the variant topic, if someone wanted to join your Discord server where you're talking about variant design, would it be okay to put an invite in our show notes for this particular episode?
Definitely, yeah. It's there as a resource. I made it so other people can use it. They're very strict guidelines, and even classic diplomacy doesn't utilize all of it. But I feel like if you try your best to utilize the rules when you can, then it'll be a better variant. So
now you mentioned that you have rules here for variant design that you're pushing basically to folks to improve their variant design abilities, and then you said something about rules for your Hearts group. Give me an idea of what you mean by that.
Well, in season 1, I was top seed for Nexus, and I actually got people coming to me and asking me how I play, because tactically I was awful. I was not a good tactical player. A lot of my Hearts actually taught me how to play tactically. I didn't even think about supporting something instead of support attacking something instead of holding. So I was that bad. But my diplomacy was amazing. And so I pretty much started playing games and breaking down exactly what I would do and what I would say and how I would say it. And from there, I just refined them down to a bunch of rules. That way, no matter how you play, you can, if you're in a weird spot, you can always pull that rule and utilize it to the best of your ability. And so
that's what you mean when you say
a lot of places to learn tactics. There's not a lot of places to learn diplomacy.
Well, except by watching other people, and it's hard to do that because you can't see with the internal discussions very easily.
Correct.
Well, Keith, do you have any other final thoughts for our Deadline audience about any other diplomacy-related subject? This is your chance to get up on your soapbox and complain and or inculcate your values into the world of diplomacy.
I don't like to do that. I don't know. Just play the way you want to play. Try playing whatever you want. I mean,
well, Isn't that right? I mean, I know you're sort of giving an off the cuff answer, but isn't that right that people should play to their strengths and lean into what feels good to them?
Well, yeah. I mean, always. I mean, it's a game. Have fun. I mean, do what's fun for you. Don't be afraid to try a different format, because there's always people that would welcome you to do so. And if you don't like it, you don't have to do it again. But yeah, definitely try everything. Have fun.
Well, that's good advice, Keith. Unless there's any other thoughts, I really appreciate you being on deadline again, and look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thanks to all of you watching at home. We hope you have enjoyed this broadcast of Deadline. If you have news, ideas for features, or feedback of any kind, please feel free to send an email to info@diplobn.com, or you can drop me a line directly using davidhood@dixiecon.com. To review all of our broadcast offerings, visit our website at www.diplobn.com. This is David Hood signing off. I wish you brightness and bliss and, of course, Belgium.